So for Chapter 2, I'm going to introduce you to a few new supplies and materials that you've taken home. Each of us should have a little booklet that's meant to replicate a shirt placket. And so for some of you guys, it may lap one direction, or for others, it may lap the other. And part of what we'll talk over in class is what that directionality signifies when it comes to prospective gender in dress. We also have our shank button, our 4-hole button, our snap, and our hook and bar that will make up the different fasteners of this closure. You'll want to have some scissors or snips, a needle. We're going to use one of these toothpicks when we go to sew in our 4-hole button. And then silamide is a type of stronger thread than what you're used to working with when it comes to the hand sewing thread that we've been using on the machines. And so that thread is polyester cotton thread that can be hand torn and ripped if need be, whereas silamide is pre-waxed and pre-cut thread. It comes in predetermined lengths that are usually pretty good for getting a few closures. So the first thing we'll do is just place out our markings. Now I'm going to mark some plus signs down the center about equidistant apart, about 1.5 inches or so apart. Now note, these are not where I'll be placing all of my samples or my fasteners, just where I'll be situating them on the placket. So for some of them, like our buttons, we will center on the placket, but for our hooks and bars and snaps, they will move towards one of the sides depending on the overlap and underlap of your garment. So just because I'm putting a mark here does not mean that my snap will go here, for example. So make sure that you're watching when we get to those parts of the sewings. The reason why I'm having you guys put your markings here is so then that way when we go to do our buttons and our snaps, we have enough room to work and we're not going to get too close to this section up top that will make it harder to work once we get closer to that stitch line. A shank button has a little bit of height to it. So we'll often see these when it comes to coats or woolen things that have some thickness to the fabric. So then that way the button itself can kind of float between the surfaces and give a little bit of ease. So what I want you to notice on your own is how wide is that shank from side to side. So if we look on either side of this shank, that's about 1/8 of an inch for mine. So keeping that measurement in mind, the goal will be that once we get this stitched onto the fabric, is that our stitch work will only be that same width when we go on the wrong side of our fabric. So to start our stitch, I'll take my needle, and we're pretending that this is the outside of the garment, right? The outside of our lovely square shirt. And I've marked on the right side, but because the button is going to hide that, this is one of the few times where marking on the right side of the fabric is okay. But I am going to hide my knot on the inside of the fabric, and we know that because we can see this folded edge to signify the underlap of this button placket. So taking my double threaded silamide with my knot at the end of the two tails, I'm going to come up through that plus sign, and I'm going to do it just a little ways off from center. So then that way when I stitch my button on, the button itself will be centered. So I'll pull my needle through and pull my thread nice and tight so that it's come down to the surface of my fabric. And now I'll thread my button on. So I'll thread my button, and then I will go back through the fabric that same distance away as my shank width. So for me, it was 1/8 of an inch. We all should be about 1/8 of an inch, but just double check your button. So now I'm going through the fabric, and you see how I can ignore the button because as I tighten, it pulls itself down to the surface. And then I can look, my threads have twisted. So I'm just going to loosen that up. So then that way, can you guys see how the threads are going through the buttonhole and then down to the fabric, they're unobstructed. It's just a straight loop. And that's kind of the goal. We want to pull our fabric down, so then that way, or pull our thread down, so then that way it's nice and tight. But if we look on the wrong side, I now have 2 points of reference. I have the knot from where I took my first stitch, and I have from where I came out of the fabric. And now we're just going to keep using those 2 points of reference. Because if I put my thread, my needle, through the fabric, right on that stitch. Can you see how I'm coming up right next to that hole? So I can pull that tight and then go through that hole of the shank, complete that stitch, and then flip my fabric, and I'll come back through right next where my other stitch was. And as I pull tight, I'm making sure that my thread isn't looping around the button. And then we just keep doing the same thing. In order to be a nice and secure button, we're going to stitch about 5 or 6 times through this hole. And I am angling my needle as I come up and down to accommodate for how big the diameter of the actual button is. And if my thread loops around like that, I'm just watching it to make sure that as I come up through the fabric, I go straight into the hole, go through the hole, and then come down the fabric. If I notice I have little loopies on the back, that means that I didn't pull my thread tight enough. So I will go back to the other side and pull on each of the 2 threads individually until I can find the one that was loose. And that can happen when you're working with double thread, but we like double thread for theater because it keeps things more secure. And then once you've stitched 5 or 6 times, on the wrong side, you'll take another little pick stitch and you'll wrap your thread twice around it, and then you'll pull that tight, and that's your double locking stitch. And because we have multiple layers, right next to where I'm working, I'll go into the fabric. I'm not going through to the outside, but I'll pull my thread away just that 1/4 inch so that when I do trim this, I've hidden that tail inside the layers of the placket. And that's how, with the button, you can see that the stitches are almost invisible because they really only travel on the inside of that little U shape of the shank. They're not puckering the surface. They're only taking up the space of the metal of the button, which allows it to sit nice and lifted from the surface. For this next sample, we're going to sew this 4-hole button, and we're going to give it a little bit of height, and that's what the toothpick is for. If this was a regular dress shirt or blouse, we would just sew it straight to the fabric and not worry about it because the fabric itself is thin enough that it won't cause for concern. But have any of you guys ever worn suspenders that had buttons? Or things that were a regular button but it needed a little bit of height? So a wool jacket or something that didn't have a shank button. So we're going to do a 4-hole self-shanked button. And that'll have the same beginning steps as you would for any regular button, but we're going to be keeping a little bit of looseness in our stitch to allow to make a trunk or a tail on the underside. So look at your button and see the spacings of those 4 holes. So similar to how we did the 1/8 inch spacing of the shank button, we'll have a similar kind of mathematical feel for when we do this 4-hole button. So we have our plus sign, and there's kind of 4 quadrants of it, just like there are 4 buttonholes. So I'm going to come up from the back side just like I did with the shank button, but if I come up in this top left corner of my plus sign, then I'm going to feed my button on eventually on that what will become the top right corner. So I'll pull my thread tight, and then I'll go through my button. And now to make sure, whenever you're sewing a button, you have to make sure when you come up through a button, you go back down through the button. It's very easy to forget this step and just stitch around the edge of the fabric. But if you do, then you'll see that you never want to have exposed threads. It should always be traveling between the button and the fabric. If you see any loops going around the side of this fold, you know something's wrong. So now, because I've come up on the top right quadrant of that plus sign, I'm going to go down through the bottom right quadrant. and I'll pull it almost tight. You'll see the button flip into place. Now, if we were sewing a regular shirt button, we would just continue like this, stitching with those 2 points for that side of the button, and then we'd move on to that side. But that won't give us any lift. So before we do the next stitch, we're going to put in our toothpick. And you see right now that it's just giving a little bit of height to that button. And when we remove it, it'll give us a little bit of ease later. So I'm going to pull my thread tight, and I'll be holding my button and my toothpick into place. And so similar to our shank button, I'm going to do this side first, where I'll be traveling between either the point where I came in with my knot or the point that I came out of my last stitch. And if I'm holding my thread nice and tight and I'm holding my button to the fabric, when I put my needle through, I should come up through that top right hole. If you're holding it too loosely, you might have some trouble. And then I'll go down through my button, aiming to come out right where that other stitch ended. And I'm going to do this 2 more times for a total of 4. So push through your fabric on that same point where you'd gone in the first time, and you'll come out that top hole. And then I'll go down through the bottom hole, coming out close to where I had exited the first 2 times. All right, I think this will be my 4th time. When you're sewing buttons, it's just about getting used to looking on both sides to make sure that you haven't left any weird loopy threads. All right, so now that I've done the 4 passes on that side, I'm just going to hop over 1/8 of an inch so that I could come up through that bottom hole. It doesn't matter which hole you come up from on the other side. You're just doing a small stitch over to travel. So I've come up through the bottom hole, and I'm going to go down through the top hole. And now I have those same 2 points of reference. I have the place where I went into the fabric to start and the place where I came out. So I'm going to go through that same area again, and I'll go down in that same part, and I'll just keep replicating that stitch. With buttons and snaps, it's do the technique once and then repeat for every hole or every pair of holes, depending on the sample. Okay, and so then I've done my 4, I think. I'm going to finish my last stitch where I'm just going to go up between the button and the fabric. This will be the thread that I use to wrap and give myself some height. But to do that, I'm going to pull out the toothpick. And so you see how there's a little bit of space between the button and the fabric. And then with my thread, I'm just going to wrap a few times. And once I've wrapped around a few times, 3 or 4 times, I'm holding my work tight. I might use another finger in the back to hold my thread or something. And I'll go down through my fabric, and I'll pull my thread tight just to make sure that my wrapping doesn't unravel. And so then on the back side, you can see that I have 1 pair of stitches for one side of the holes, a traveling stitch, 1 pair of stitches for the other, a set of stitches for the other holes. And now I'll just complete by doing my double locking stitch. So I will do a small pick stitch to set my loop, and then I'll go through that loop twice and pull it tight. And then before I cut my thread, I will go back into my work, just traveling through an internal layer. I'm not going through to the outside. And I can pull my thread tight and trim my thread tail, hiding that tail in the fabric. And that's how, from the button side, you can see that I've just traveled through vertically. You could go horizontally, some will do an X, you can be all decorative with it. But what I've stitched on the top side, I've also replicated as best I can on the bottom side.